Zhaniya Aubakirova presents a series of discussions about the place of Kazakh culture in the global world. Meetings with prominent public figures, candid conversations, collisions of opinions, and discussions about the most important things.
Hello, dear friends. Our guest today is Gulnara Rakhmetova. I've always been Gulnara Rakhmetova's great admirer. I just like everything about her. How reserved she is, the accuracy of her judgments, and her subtle perception of the world. Despite the fact that she's a very humble person, when it comes to communication, she surprisingly manages to combine this trait of her personality with a very principled life position and high moral values. Gulnara Rakhmetova, in my understanding, is one true intellectual. Hello, Gulnara.
Hello, Zhaniya.
I'm so happy to see you today.
Me too, indeed.
I must admit that I'm very interested in how you perceive the world around us, and in general, I'm curious about where you stand when it comes to the wider world of culture, considering that you're a well-known journalist and editor of one of the largest print media in the country. I know that you worked in parliament and that you published books, so obviously you have a certain position of your own, some values that have been established throughout your life.
That was a very eloquent introduction, but in fact, all my life I have been engaged in journalism, ideology, and propaganda, things that are not very welcome today. However, I'm happy to say that no ideology is being imposed on us today. We are practically free people. And the things we see on television, let's say the situation in Russia, for instance, where people are being constrained, they're being brainwashed, this all is very surprising for us. Why is this happening with Russia? I mean, we all know it has always been a reference point for liberated and intelligent people. And in comparison, it turns out that Kazakhstan is now in a more advantageous situation.
In recent years, I formed this opinion due to the fact that now everyone and everything is constantly criticized online, in social media. This all somehow reduces our chances of becoming more advanced as a society. This constant negative background is just another proof that the country has not yet gotten used to freedom of speech and does not fully understand how to utilize this freedom. Because criticizing something is one thing. Criticizing and proposing something, criticizing, being entitled to criticize, and understanding the area in which you are exercising your criticism is a completely different matter. It's important to distinguish those things, and in a sense, I know that in other countries, the very ideology that we criticize so much, it does exist. And their establishment does exercise control over the public consciousness, even if it is an invisible control. And now I think that in order to move forward, we lack some kind of greater faith in our state.
Exactly.
It slows us down. Have you ever experienced such moments when you were ideologically pressured and you didn't know what to do?
You know, I've always managed to find some kind of compromise because, let's take the field of art, for instance. In Soviet times, if an artist did not follow the rules of socialist realism,
realism, my God.
Yes, then his work would never reach his audience, and then the artist himself would go through the tests no one would ever wish for. Nevertheless, there were artists, there were writers and poets who managed to say exactly what they had in their hearts, to say things they were supposed to say.
And they were not received well? Their works were not printed?
No, they were printed, and this is the trick. They managed to find certain loopholes. Those people were able to go on stage and say what they wanted to say.
Who, for instance?
Aksyonov, for instance.
I thought you were talking about Kazakh authors.
No, I was talking about the concept.
In general.
In general, yes, young poets of the 60s. Among them was our poet Mukaghali Makhatayev. A man who was not particularly favored because he was such a great talent. I had experience working in the Байтерек magazine, which positioned itself as a magazine that facilitated the formation of a civil society.
Wow, really?
Yes, this magazine was published under the auspices of Kazakhstanskaya Pravda, and of course, I had to overcome the vectors of resistance from my leadership. Our articles were edited, but we still would invite representatives of the opposition and people of culture and art to our roundtables, those who used to say anything they wanted at that particular moment and on that particular topic. And in order to pass this text through my internal censorship, I had to overcome a lot. I was nervous and worried.
I say.
But nevertheless, I managed to do what I wanted. I bring up these examples to prove my point that a journalist, an artist, a writer, or a poet will always find certain ways and forms of expressing their points of views.
You have such a great experience of communicating with Kazakhstani public figures. Which one can you name as an example of a person who made a very strong and lasting impression on you?
You will probably be surprised, but I will start with those with whom I have not been able to talk to.
Oh, really?
Yes, and this was, first of all, the brother of my grandfather, Alkey Margulan, unfortunately.
Wow, such a prominent scholar.
Unfortunately, he was gone before I began to understand anything in this life, before I could sit down with him and have a conversation. But we all know that he was a prominent archaeologist, historian, philologist, and expert on Kazakh folklore, and we all know him as a great scientist. He was such a widely educated person, but above all, he was a prominent figure, a giant, if you want. And at the same time, he was pure, humble, and harmless. But I read that there was one dramatic episode in his life. When he was studying in Leningrad, he was arrested and thrown into prison for his friendship with Maghjan Zhumabayev.
Wow.
And he was in prison for 2 to 4 months. He was tortured there, not allowed to sleep. But after some time, his close friends saved him, and when he got out of prison, the first thing he did, he went to Maghjan, knowing full well that
it's dangerous.
It was life-threatening. Maghjan was not yet repressed, but there was already such a threat, and Margulan visited him regardless. And when you learn such details about these people and learn about these pages of their biography, you understand that these are not just our great Kazakhstanis, not disembodied creatures who ate only nectar. In fact, these were people who stood firmly with both feet on the ground, and that they had very clear ideas about what is good and what is bad. Here's the same thing with Kanysh Satbayev. Recently,
you haven't met him, have you?
I didn't meet him, unfortunately, but his portrait has always taken an honorable place in our house because my dad was also a geologist and considered himself a student of Satbayev. And at that time, Satbayev, this was the 50s, he organized a commission to study the damage that nuclear tests inflict on the earth and people. And I read these reports. Everything was really vividly reflected there. And all this was reported to Moscow, to the Central Committee of the CPSU, to the USSR Ministry of Health. And this proves that Satbayev, whom we know as a smiling, kind person who was a great example to young people, who used to help everyone to find their place in life, was in fact a kind of grandfather, you know, a Santa Claus.
This is exactly how I thought of him.
Not only was he a great professional, he was a person of
principle,
of certain principles, and it was impossible to divert him from his position.
Basically, he was fighting the system.
In fact, yes, he was jeopardizing his position, and this was happening in the 50s, exactly when the USSR was gaining nuclear power, and everyone admired it, and everyone talked about a nuclear shield, and so on, and so forth. And he, our chief academician, tried to transfer the test site to another place, trying to prevent this test from happening on the land of Kazakhstan altogether.
And there's not a single
source where we can read about it. Actually, I want to prepare an essay on this topic where I would gather all those documents.
Can you imagine what kind of time they lived in, and still we are unhappy with our lives?
I truly believe that the times don't change.
Don't change?
They don't change, and the people don't change. If Shakir Naimanov lived in our time, I'm 100% sure that there would be some bitter people who would be happy to destroy him, if you understand what I mean.
I do.
Yes. We admire the past, admire the achievements of the culture of the past, and in the present, we often try to undermine any achievements of our talents of our life, and so on. For example, they say that Kazakhstani culture is dying. But in fact, culture is such a thing that regenerates itself and seeps through any crevices, through any stones. It seems to me that such alarmist sentiments about our culture are premature. In general, culture as a concept is so multifaceted, so multidimensional. First and foremost, culture is a civilization. Then culture is an activity, a spiritual and creative human activity. Culture is a way of life. This is all very strongly interconnected, and therefore, if we take it more seriously without shouting that everything is lost, if we, while raising our children, would introduce them to what was created before us, remember the best examples, and pass them on, then nothing will perish. In order for a normal generation to grow up, the older ones should not be lazy. We must feel some kind of responsibility, not just to do things in order to have someone could fetch us a glass of water, yes, but to act because we don't want to leave a scorched land behind us. But I'm now talking in platitudes.
That's because the topic of culture is endless.
Endless.
You can talk about it from a variety of positions, and it's really difficult, so it's always interesting to hear some examples. So I'm happy to tell everyone that my dream has come true. There are a lot of Kazakh melodies that I've known and loved from my very childhood. I was able to order our composers to make arrangements. There was a rigorous selection and even a kind of competition. And it was such a success because our Kazakh melodies, the melodies of our favorite songs, suddenly sounded completely different. They thundered all over the world and acquired universal significance. I suspected that this might happen, but didn't expect that it would be so good, and most importantly, that the audience would receive it so well. And now it seems to me that we're all concerned about our culture becoming understood and loved, not only by us, but throughout the world.
I wanted to make a comment about music.
About music?
Yes, once I attended the cultural days of Kazakhstan in Germany, and there were our kobyz players who performed Brahms. And it was then that I felt for the first time how universal our culture is.
Absolutely.
You know, Brahms on kobyz sounds unexpectedly dramatic, incredibly tragic, and the melody was so deep, so piercing even.
They improved Brahms.
Yes, they have added something that he didn't initially have in his melody.
Yes.
Still, we are embarrassed of ourselves. We are ashamed of our abilities.
How so?
There is this humility and self-criticism that are innate in us. When our people perform abroad and when they reach great heights, like Dimash, like Daneliya Tuleshova and Maria Mudryak, we immediately begin to say that they gained popularity, fame, and became loved precisely due to the fact that they were first discovered by a foreign audience. But be that as it may, wherever their talent is revealed,
They're still Kazakhstanis.
they are still our people. They were born here, fed by our water. These are the people who have our national code in their DNAs.
Of course.
And instead of dismissing this, we should learn how to be more grateful for their giftedness.
Look, you're clearly endowed with a literary gift. What does it give you? You write books, don't you?
Yes, I have two books. One of them is about my work in journalism. The second book is dedicated to Murat Osmanov. It is called 10 Years in Politics, 10 years later. And now I'm working on my novel.
So you finally decided to?
Yes, I made my mind, and I derive great pleasure from it, because it turns out I like to work with words, and I like to fantasize. My book will be dedicated to a woman, a Soviet woman from the generation of our mothers. Those women were very special. They were very active and very independent. And yet, they did not have the conditions that we have now. They took care of their families, they worked, defended dissertations, and they were succeeding.
So, do you think we have better lives than our parents did?
Much better.
Way much better? And the pressure?
It was easier for them relationships-wise. They were more open and honest, probably. The living conditions were quite difficult. It's impossible to say now who had an easier life and who had a more difficult one.
It's impossible. I think we experience more moral pressure, right? And values change a lot. You know, I have this question in my head. Do you consider yourself to be out of time? Do you ever think that time has changed so much that our generation does not fit in anymore?
I have never thought such a thing about myself.
Well done to you.
Thanks. No, I do not consider myself as an out-of-time person. First of all, because I have very modern children, and in my family we communicate very closely and exchange opinions. And what excites me excites them. What excites them makes me think. Then the fact that we master all the technical innovations that now exist in the world doesn't allow us to lag behind life, and in the same way we are present on social networks, we use gadgets. The only thing, of course, is that our professions are changing. If earlier journalism was journalism of fact, we had genres, we distinguished reportage from correspondence, correspondence from articles.
корреспонденцию от статьи. Сейчас журналистам, по-моему, это безразлично.
Now journalists, in my opinion, are indifferent to this because some new types of journalism are emerging that have not yet been fully developed. For example, immersive journalism or journalism of big data is generally a dark forest for me, and here I am falling behind. Although I was very much interested in immersive journalism.
What is immersive journalism?
Immersive journalism is presence of journalism, meaning that people put on special VR goggles and find themselves in certain situations, a reproduction of hostilities or some kind of catastrophe.
And that's how they make reportage?
Yes, these are fully immersive reportages.
Virtual reality.
It's all virtual reality. Yes. I don't know how humanity will live in this virtual reality, but some time will pass and soon it all will become
A regular thing.
Yes.
My dear Gulnara, the conversation about culture is never ending indeed. It's like Oriental music, Indian music. And by the way, Kazakh music is also like this. It begins somewhere, it imperceptibly arises from some non-existence, moves there, approaches us, expands, intensifies, and then gradually in due time it goes away. It goes either into the past or into eternity or into the future. It may be connecting times and our conversations are the same. Today we may have finished, but we will continue indefinitely. Thank you very much, and I will see you soon.
Thank you. I will look forward to meeting you again.